¿Me oyen? Sí.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here today, for your patience and your passion for queuing for so long. I learned that Laurie was here because I heard your applause. So I suppose that all of us who are here is because we admire her and we are interested in her so that we can admire her further in the future. And I think this is a fundamental artist. Now that she's not listening to me, I think she's a key artist, and it's a pleasure for me to being here today introducing her. And the fact that she is here today comes from the collaboration between Fundación Telefónica and Rizoma Festival, which was inaugurated a couple of days ago and will be on until the 3rd of December with plenty of activities. And Laurie Anderson has a key role in this festival through one of these artworks that is presented in the 4th floor in this very building. I will tell you about it later on. We talked about it yesterday at length, but I have to tell you that it's a memorable experience. I really look forward to going back into the experience again and to experience it non-stop, and I'm very happy that it's only here until January, because otherwise I might be prone to falling into an addiction that would take me out of the real world. I think it's a wonderful work in virtual reality and augmented reality. So this piece of work is presented after almost 40 years of professional career by Laurie. I think that it's extraordinary, and I was lucky enough to see Merce Cunningham introducing a retrospective of his best works before he passed away, and he came out to tell about his most recent works back then, and he was cooperating with a series of programmers and other people about a project that showed a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest with technologies that made them younger than they were actually by age. And this is the same feeling that I get from Laurie Anderson. When I heard her speaking yesterday, she made me feel very old. I think we need people like her to refresh us and make us younger in our spirit. I don't want to repeat many things from what I said yesterday, but I'm afraid that many of you who were here yesterday might feel that you are reliving the same day. But and I'll try to avoid this, but there are some things that I need to say. Laurie's career is not a single path one; it's a very lengthy career. She started working at the end of the 70s. By the end of the 70s, we learned about her name with an album, with a song in particular, Oh Superman, in 1981. And there have been many decades of work after this with a creative development that has not been linear at all. She has moved in all directions, and sometimes it might have looked that this was a sort of chaotic growth, but it was a wonderfully structured chaos. Those who are fans of Laurie Anderson might have come to her by her music face. Some like her by her works of art and the use of different means with artistic purposes, but none of her work can leave you indifferent, and sometimes it's very difficult to define. And when I was thinking how to make a profile of her, I found it very difficult. I can say that she's a performer, a photographer, a singer, an artist, but how can you summarize all this? Well, she actually accepted the label, not exactly because she felt that she could be identified with that, but at least she could feel a certain relief in front of the media. She is a multimedia artist. She uses all the resources that are at hand, which are very wide and varied, to express what she's interested in. And this is maybe somewhat easier to define, or maybe more difficult, because it's a concept that is very wide, very broad. She's interested in language, but not language as a means of communication, but language as an architecture, a creative architecture, as the architecture that makes us different from other species. Language is for her something very flexible. She told an anecdote yesterday that I thought was wonderful. She I think she was carrying her little brothers in a stroller, and she decided to go through a nice lake, and at a given moment the stroller sank, and she later arrived home with her little brothers, carrying her little brothers. And when she arrived there, her mother told her, "You've shown that you were a great swimmer and very brave." And she explained that this is a proof of the way that a simple sentence can change your whole future. This is one of the anecdotes that she told us yesterday that really caught my attention. She tells us about language, and how does she do this? She does it in a very simple way, by telling stories. At the end of the day, what she does is storytelling. This is not the same as inventing these stories. When we are at the post-truth times, this could seem somewhat negative, but the stories that she tells give importance, give transcendence to everything that we share, because the stories she tells, even though they come from a very rich and particular and characteristic imagination, connects to something that is meaningful to us. So her stories, I wish they would make the history with a capital H instead of the one that we are used to listening to and to learning. The story maybe should be made of all the stories of each person, and I think this is one of the sides of her work that is appealing to me and is important. Today we're talking about the creative process, which is very interesting, but I would like to talk very briefly about the artwork that we are presenting here. You have to book the slot in the website from Espacio Fundación Telefónica. It's called Chalkroom. It's a free installation that you can visit freely. It's a space that is somewhat dusty and dark, and it has nothing to do with the gaming experience, and I invite you to try it. And I do not want to talk too much, and I would like to leave the stage to Laurie, but I would like to tell you that Laurie is an artist that is revered by so many of us who are here today, and so many people outside. Artists can tell about their times by using facts or actions, and they allow us to understand our times beyond reason. And I think that could be a definition of an artist, but there are very few artists who are telling us about our time and also about civilization. And I think she has managed to tell us about civilization beyond our times. She is one of the figures within the cultural or scientific or politics world that you can say that they make civilization settle. I leave the floor to her. We're talking today about her creative process, and I'm looking forward to listening to what she has to tell us. And we will have time to ask her questions. I will ask her some questions, and then you from the audience can also ask her some questions. I'll leave the floor to Laurie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. I don't know what the creative process is, so that's number one, okay? Because I really don't know what I'm doing, and I'm just curious about. I'm curious who is here today, and I'm guessing a lot of artists, but I'm just wondering how many people are painters here, and what about writers? Yeah, and filmmakers. Yeah, and sculptors? One sculptor, okay. Okay, great. Stay with that. Okay, well, I know I've forgotten a lot of. How about dancers? Wow, okay, dancers. And what have I forgotten? Musicians, okay. Okay, great. Okay, so. You know, and how many people would say I'm a multimedia person, like do lots of stuff? Right, I'm in your camp too, you know. And I think, you know, I always say to young artists who are thinking like, what should I call myself? I always suggest multimedia because it's meaningless. right? Who knows what that means? Everybody in the world now is a multimedia artist of some kind, working with technology. It's no big thing, you know. So to say that is a little bit crazy. Let's see if we can get a new picture up. Can we switch to the other system? There we go. So this is just a scroll here. And many times when I'm starting something that I don't really know what I'm going to do, I make some kind of diagram about it. Now, so today I'm just going to talk in detail about a couple of projects and then show you a few images, but not a whole lot of images, but just to give you some idea of how some of these things get started. So I'm going to first tell you about a very weird job that I had, which was artist in residence at NASA. Now, this had a very strange start. I was having a very bad day in the studio. Everything was sounding so stupid, and I was just like really depressed. It sounded really bad. The phone rang, and the guy said, "I'm from NASA, and we'd like you to be the first artist in residence." And I was like, "You're not from NASA." I hung up the phone. Just when somebody tells you offers you your dream, that you don't believe them. So he called back again and he said, "No, I'm from NASA, and we'd like you to be the first artist in residence at NASA." And so I said, "Well, what does that mean with a space program? Where are you? What residence are you talking about?" And he said, I said, "What does that mean?" And he said he didn't know what that meant, and what did I think it meant? I said, "Who are you people?" So I took the job because I didn't know what it was, and no one had done it before. So I thought this is a good job for me. So I would just I spent a lot of time going around to different places in NASA, to Hubble space, to Hubble telescope in Maryland, to Houston. To controls system, to places in California, Pasadena, Jet Propulsion Lab, and I was just kind of like a fly on the wall. And it was a really wonderful experience. I got to talk to a lot of engineers and people that I wouldn't run into in the art world. Somebody who's making the fastest vehicle in the world, things like this, and but really making something in that context is a little bit absurd. I mean, they're really already making gigantic artworks. Like, for example, they're making a stairway to space in the middle of the Pacific. It's a big platform that they're putting in the middle of the ocean so that you can pull the rockets up, and you don't have to have the big for thrust and get above gravity. You just move the equipment above gravity and then just drive off. So it is very efficient to do it that way, and it's a very crazy project. I think that they invited me to do this because I had this. They had this idea that I'm this multimedia artist, and that I would do something like, bounce light from one satellite onto another, onto the dark side of the moon, kind of thing. So when I told them at the end of this couple of years that I was going to write a poem, they were like, "Why?" They just had no concept of why you would do something like that instead of, some sort of sexy techno project. So anyway, I did get a chance to meet a lot of the people that had a lot of time to talk. People at NASA are very busy, and I'm standing there with my artist in residence badge with a little rocket, and they were going, nobody even said, "Do we have an artist?" No, they didn't pay any attention at all to me. I'm just free, so to look around, poke around. And so I talked to a lot of nanotechnologists, and they are the theorists, and they are the kind of like dreamers there, and they have more time to think about things. And so they were always talking about, Einstein, and they were always citing Einstein, and they were saying, that he had rejected some of his most well-known theories. Why? Because they weren't beautiful. And I'm like, what does that actually mean? what does that mean for someone to say that? And I realized, that for Einstein, perhaps that had something to do with symmetry, for example, which he considers beautiful. Now, you take that idea of symmetry to Japan, for example, and they sometimes don't know what you're talking about. Why does it make it better that one thing looks like the other? That there's this kind of rhyming structure, two columns, or the thing and its meaning. This kind of rhyming to something makes it somehow more beautiful, more meaningful. Why? Because we have two legs, two arms, a bicameral brain. Why? And their aesthetic is more towards something like the haiku, which is a single thing, just invoking a single moment. A cloudy day, the puppeteer coughs. That's the poem. That's the whole thing. It's not like, this rose reminds me of love. No, it's really not about structuring objects and how and pointing to what they mean. It is a very different thing, a much more sort of immediate situation. I was there at the time. This is the very first image of Mars, which was from the 60s. It was a bounce back of sound. So this is a graphic representation of sound. I was there in the time when we were sending so you see, we were sending. It had nothing to do with this. We were sending these little robots, Spirit and Opportunity. This was in 2004, so this is quite a while ago. We were sending them to Mars. And so we would test these things out in the parking lot. They're really tiny little size of dogs, really sweet little rovers and robots. And this is a painting of Mars that they put on the wall of the parking lot. So we would take these out to the parking lot and drive them around and test them, and then ship them to Mars. Now, it's very hard to get to Mars. It's 300 million miles away in 6 months. So these were these little robots were sent off, and there were 3 missions to Mars at that time: a British and a Japanese and American. The British mission seemed to have stopped working, and the Japanese had exploded, and the American one was lost. So we were waiting for this. This is something else. Let's go back to this. We were waiting for some kind of signal from the rocket, but it had been many weeks since we'd heard anything. So at one point, on the day that the craft was supposed to land on Mars, all of the designers gathered in a room, and it was about this number of people that are here in this room, and everyone had designed a tiny part of the rovers. Nobody understood how the whole thing worked. Everyone just did their one thing, and so it had been years of work to get these things to up to Mars, and we were looking at the time. There were no cameras on Mars. No one had landed with cameras, so we were looking at a series of numbers, a number array that had frozen. And the numbers had frozen because it was the last information that we'd received from the craft. So we're just sitting there, just thinking it had been lost and it had disintegrated somewhere. Suddenly, at the moment when it was supposed to be entering that atmosphere, all the numbers started going wild, like, and everyone was like, "Oh!" And because that number series indicated that the craft had entered Martian atmosphere. So everyone was like, it's here, and then the next series of numbers indicated that the parachute had opened and the craft was dropping down to Mars. And the next, poof, it made impact and then rolled almost the exact number of feet that had been prescribed and stopped. The craft opened, it unzipped itself, the little robot rovers opened their solar panels to the sun, and they charged, and then they rolled down a little ramp, and they began taking 360-degree photographs, high-definition photographs of Mars, and sending them back to Earth. And everybody there was just like, humans made this. It was so thrilling. I'm not a techno geek, I promise, but I do like it when things work like that. It was quite exciting. It was really a thrilling thing to see. Now, I was, as I said, the first artist in residence there, and got a lot of opportunities to see a lot of really interesting things. I was also the last artist in residence. And the way this worked was in Congress, they were having NASA is largely a military operation, basically. It is doing, it used to be about, well, even at the beginning it was a military operation. It was a competition with Russia to get to the moon, supposedly, but it was always about military applications. So, with some scientific things that you learn, of course, along the way, but basically it was that. So the Congress was looking through the budget of NASA, and they're going, okay, $30 trillion for spy satellites, excellent. 25 billion for these other surveillance situations, and then they're looking $20,000 for an artist in residence. This is an outrage, They had these kind of whistleblower guys who were like, this is terrible. Well, what are we wasting the money for? And so it was canceled. Now, I tried to get this reinstated because I think it's a very good idea to have an artist in residence at NASA. I think it's a very good idea to have an artist in residence in Congress, an artist in residence in the Supreme Court, artist in residence in the White House, I think artists do have a different point of view, and it would be an interesting way to incorporate different aspects. However, that's not working out so far. So we'll see what happens. Now, I'm going to look at I'm going to jump back in time, I think, for a second, to show you a few things before I go into a longer description of some work. We'll go way back to a work called Duets on Ice that was something I did in 1975. Now, I really love inventing instruments and making things. As a sculptor, when I started out, I wasn't the kind of sculptor who liked to invent new forms. I felt somehow that there were enough forms in the world already, and that I would try to use the ones that are already there and just make them do something else. So I was interested in function in that way. So this is a violin that I made, which was self-playing, and inside it has a speaker, and then you can play duets with it live. Now, this cassette was a cassette, so it was on an endless loop, and so when you have an endless loop, when is it over? So the timing mechanism were these ice skates that were blades frozen into blocks of ice. So when the ice melts and you lose your balance, that's the end of the show. So there was just a kind of clock that I used. Now, I did these concerts in Italy, and this guy in the pork pie hat came to everyone, even though these were not announced anywhere. He would show up, and he would be the kind of maître d'. He would be like, hello, greeting everyone, and before doing these concerts, I would do it in very clumsy Italian. I would say, I'm playing these duets in honor of my grandmother, because on the day she died, I went out onto this frozen lake, and I saw a lot of ducks, and they were honking and flapping their wings, and I got quite close to them, and they didn't move away. And then I saw that their feet had been frozen into the new layer of ice. Anyway, this guy was explaining to newcomers in the crowd, as people came to hear the music, she's playing these duets because once she and her grandmother were frozen together in a lake. And I guess, why not? That wasn't a bad explanation, really. So anyway, I'm going to show you briefly a couple of other instruments that I designed. One was the Vial Phonograph, which is a needle in the bow, and then these records that have one sustained note per band. It sounds really terrible, but it was a way of kind of doing some early scratching stuff and really early DJ stuff. This is another instrument that has, instead of a bridge on the violin and strings, it has a playback head of a Revox tape machine, and there's tape on the bow instead of horsehair. So it's you're making kind of like audio palindromes. So, which are not predictable palindromes like God is always dog backwards, but when you work in the world of sound, it's very sort of a beautiful flow of back and forth. And so I did a number of songs with that, and also made a bunch of works for orchestras as well that were in this backwards world, which was often they were often lyrics that would be scrubbed back and forth. So again, it was almost a scrubbing, almost editing sort of motion. Many of these instruments come from the most practical things that you can imagine, which is just if you're editing a piece of tape, you run it back and forth over the head, and then as I was playing and editing and playing and editing, I thought, oh, this is a similar motion. And so a lot of these things come from very, very hands-on way of doing things. And this is another instrument that was a neon violin, which had a lot of like really crazy feedback. And I liked that very much. This was an instrument that was a digital scratching instrument that I did for a kind of ill-fated opera that I made about Moby Dick, which I described a couple nights ago. Anyway, this was an instrument that is a digital instrument. And, I just find that when people are playing like with laptops and electronics and stuff, it's very boring to watch them play. They're just like going, and it's like watching somebody iron or something. It's really not that interesting. And I love instruments where you really need your body. You throw your body into it. You use the physicality of it. So saxophone or the stringed instruments where you're just, you're using your energy. And so I was doing this opera based on Moby Dick. And so this instrument is for some of the actors who were sort of sailors, and so it's a kind of harpoon instrument that you use sliding and the fingering on it. But you really need to push and pull it in ways that almost like one of the an African bead instrument in a way. Going farther back in terms of the body in instruments, this was a table that I designed in the 70s, and I just recently rebuilt this thing, so it sounds a lot better now, but it still sounded good then. What this is a table that you hear sound through bone conduction, and this sound that comes through, you make contact with the table with your elbow, and it comes up in here. It's like putting on very loud headphones. And speaking of the creative process, like most of the things that I've done kind of by mistake. And this began with I was typing something on an electric typewriter that had a motor in it, and it was not coming out very well. I was pretty depressed. I put my head in my hands, and I was like, oh, this is so true. What makes you think you can write? So I heard this, coming up through the table, and it was it was the motor of the typewriter coming up through my elbows and into my head. And I thought, I'm going to build a singing table. So that's what this is. It's a singing table. And it works with, inside it are drivers, are the sound source, which are very low frequency sounds, which are mostly are low frequency, and they travel very well. Sub sounds are very sort of stable sound waves, and so I could push them through these electronics and through the bones into the head. Treble is more skittish, so the waveform is like, and it's harder to control. So it was very easy to do, like a Fender Rhodes sound or bass sound on a piano, and they would also be stereo, so that you hear one thing in one arm and another thing in the other arm. And but I couldn't make language work, because language uses treble and uses high-end stuff. It's all the fricatives, all the otherwise it's without the definition of the mid-range and the highs going. So those were hard to control. I finally figured out how to do that with a lot of tinkering around with electronics. And so the first language that I used in this was a line from a poem, 17th century English metaphysical love poet named George Herbert. And he was writing a poem, a song to music. And so he wrote the line was, "Now I and you without a body move." And so you hear in one ear, you hear, "Now I and you without a body," and then the word move slowly moves through your head. And you have a sensation then, when your head becomes the speaker, really, and the room, the chamber, you have this sensation that it's this big empty space, which you kind of, suspected that it might be all along, this big kind of cavernous thing. So I love working with sound systems that make you feel very your body in a very distinctly different physical way. Here's one more instrument before we go into more detail on another piece, which is called tilt. And tilt is I was asked by a Swiss company to make a music box. And so, again, as I said, I like to just repurpose things. So this is a carpenter's level. And on each end is a speaker. And it's a duet of he sings and she sings. So if you tilt it this way, you hear only him, and if you tilt it this way, you hear only her. And then if they're level, it's a duet, and it's controlled by this like little central thing here. Now I'm going to jump ahead and say a couple of things about a project. We'll go back to this for a second. A project that had a very long lifespan and changed through time in a lot of ways. And I'll preface this by saying that when I started doing work, I was really a sculptor, but also a filmmaker. And I would make these little films, and I would show them in film festivals. And by film festival, I mean 6 people in a loft in New York looking at each other's movies. So that's what was the festival, and I would never be finished with the sound in time, so I would stand in front of the film and I would play the music and do the stories. And that essentially became what I did. So again, something that came out of not finishing something or just some sort of way around a mistake was how I began to work with things. So I worked with a lot of different kinds of projecting things on small clay figures, because I wanted to try to get stories into a visual context. And that's hard to do because people walk through museums at a certain speed. I was at the Prado this morning, and people are really painted probably 10 seconds for each painting, and also they want you to move through fairly quickly. You can't really stand in front of something for an hour without being shooed away. So anyway, doing something time-based in a museum is very difficult. Those of you who work with something that has a narrative structure to it know that's true, and that there aren't any really museums of narrative. They just don't exist. So I've always been somewhat of an orphan in that world, because there are not these places which you can put them. So I am doing things in other contexts, or finding ways around that. So one of those was a way of around that had to do with projection onto figures. In 1998, I was asked to do a big sound installation in Krems. Krems is a little town in Austria near Vienna, and there's a Kunsthalle there, which is very beautiful and but very, very reverberant. It's connected to a church, so it's this 13th century church, which was originally a big cathedral, and then became a kind of pilgrim flophouse during the Crusades, and then it was all of these movements, and then became a cultural center. This sort of usage arc that sometimes happens with cultural centers. So I got there, and every sound that I tried in this cathedral was just whoa. I couldn't control it. It was all vaporous, and I wasn't so into reverb at the time, and so I didn't know what to do, and the curators kept saying, "What's your project?" And I was like, "I don't know yet. Do you have an idea?" "Not really." And so I was there 3 days, and finally I went up to the bell tower of this church, and I looked out, and in the middle of this perfect little Austrian town is a maximum security prison. I was like, whoa. What? And over there was a big guard tower and a guard with a machine gun pointing at me. And so I'm in the bell tower of the church, and he's in the guard tower of the prison. We're looking at each other, and I was like, okay. So I came down. I said to the curators, what we're going to do is a work about telepresence, how telepresence works in our culture. I'm going to build a video studio in the prison, and I'm going to ask one of the prisoners to sit very still for a couple of months, and I'm going to then make a life-size cast of this prisoner, and put it in the church, into apps. And I'm going to beam this image of this person sitting onto a cast of his body, so it'll be like a kind of living sculpture. So, and it will be about the attitudes of the church and the prison to the body, incarnation and incarceration, so there and not there. And surprisingly, the curators go, okay. I was like, really? Are you sure? And so, when you get a chance to come up with an idea, why not make it a, kind of a wild one? And then maybe a few days later, they said, actually, Austrian law forbids this because the prisoner under Austrian law no longer owns his own image. A very 21st century problem. Who owns your image when you put it out on Facebook? Who actually has the rights to this and can do whatever they want with it? And it's a big battle with a lot of the tech companies now who actually owns this stuff, or your information as well. So anyway, I was kind of relieved, because at that point I thought, maybe it's not the smartest thing to beam a prisoner, a killer, and put him in a church and an apps in a quite conservative country like Austria. Maybe it's suicidal. So anyway, it was off, and then it was back on again, and it was back off again. It didn't happen. This was in 1998. 1999, the Whitney Museum asked me to do something, and I proposed working with Sing Sing Prison, which is a big prison in New York, just up the river, and it would be about the same thing of having a prisoner sit very still, and you beam this image of them down to the museum. So it's about guarded institutions. What do you have in there that has those guards? What are you guarding? And so it was about, of course, value and time, and what happens when you're asked to spend the rest of your life in prison, and what that kind of temporality is like. So there were lots of variations on that theme. They eventually also decided that, strangely enough, it was right at the time when prisons in the United States were being privatized. And so it was suddenly this giant uptick in prisoners. So suddenly there was one in every 100 Americans was in prison. And you're thinking, why is that? Is a sudden surge of bad guys? Of course, what happened was that it became a capitalist venture. It became a business. And what does a business need? If you're a prison, you need customers. So many of the people in Sing Sing, who were they? They were people who were standing on the street with a joint. They were not even smoking it. They were not selling it. And they could be arrested under the Rockefeller law and get 25 years to life. Life in prison. Standing there with a joint. Life. Many people got life in prison, and many of them were artists, and they're in Sing Sing prison now. So anyway, I spent lots of time at the prison and meeting people, and just mostly meditators and people who were capable of sitting very still. And we talked about what it would mean. They were enthusiastic, some of the, but at the end, the museum said, well, actually, we think this isn't a project for us. They pulled the plug, which was, they said it's a bit of a political problem for us because we don't really want to get involved in politics. I was like, politics? Okay. It's maybe not politics you're talking about. Anyway, so I was very disappointed. A couple of months later, I was describing this project to a curator who's a very can-do guy, Germano Cellant, is an Italian curator, and I was saying, I wanted to do this project about time in prisons and teleportation and, there and not there, and he very quickly said, I found a cultural institution and a prison. So we did this project in Milan in 1999. And we built a video studio in a prison, and we beamed this prisoner, to the Prada Foundation in Milan. And this was Santino, and this is what his statue kind of looked like. And so he sat there for 3 months, very, very still, not moving, his image onto a cast of his body. Now, of course, you can imagine the difficulty, those of you who are artists who have collaborated with people, the line between what you call collaboration and exploitation, it's very close sometimes. So I needed to find a way to talk to people who might want to do it. I needed to find a collaborator, a person who would sit there and do this and that wanted to do it. This San Vittorio prison in Milan, I spent a lot of time there talking to the inmates. Who's there? White-collar prisoners. And these are guys who single-handedly basically, dismantled the Italian economy, let's say. They were very clever lawyers, speaking Greek and Latin. They had the ability to have their wine collection in prison. They were in for life. But they could invite their families, and they could cook, and they could have knives, and they could, they were writing their books, and they were very, very elegant guys, and they were all wearing Armani, and, everything was cool except for, the shoes, because the shoes were just slippers, because they were going nowhere ever. So we talked a lot about this project and why I was doing it. I learned a lot about why I was doing it as well from these guys. And we had a really great time talking, but because they were lawyers and because they're very skilled in manipulating your attention and pushing it over, just like in the courtroom, into another direction, mental manipulation, I'm suddenly talking to one guy in the corner, Santino. They had decided who my collaborator was. It was a fiction that I was deciding. So I'm talking to this guy, Santino. This guy. Santino, bank robber and murderer. And I said, Santino, if we do this together, he's also a writer, a playwright. I said, what is your interest in this? What would your motivation be to do this? And he said, I see this as a virtual escape. And I said, you're my man. So we did this, and he wrote about it, and he sat very still for months. And his image was beamed into the Prada Foundation, and his girlfriend came every day and stood next to this projection He was not able to see her because he could only see his own image just as far as he had to adjust the projection of his body onto the cast of that. Now, I always wanted to do this in the United States for many obvious reasons, so when the Park Avenue Armory asked me like 3 years ago to do something, I suggested doing a prison project that would involve, first of all, one very large figure, and the Park Avenue Armory is almost a block tall. It's a very, very cathedral-like space in New York and huge, or I said maybe we could also work with the upstate prison system, which is huge, and also the cameras are very much a part, as you can imagine, of prisons, not just for surveillance, because there are many reality shows in prisons. Many shows about prisoners and their stories. And so these would be, this was also called Life, and these would be people serving life sentences. And so these would be from the upstate New York prison system, and one from each place, and I thought it would be sort of like an Egyptian kind of temple of time, and so on. But anyway, we worked on this, and we worked with the wardens of all of these prisons, and we were getting it very organized, and I got all the cameras. It was quite a complicated project to do. It was like a lot of pieces to put together, and a lot of institutions to put together that were not used to working together. So it was really a challenge. And just at the end of doing this, Homeland Security got in touch with me and said, "You will never be doing this project in the United States of America." And it was kind of definitive, it was really not, there was no question that I could do it somehow. No, you will not do it. So the curator of this, of the Armory said, "Okay, so what's plan B?" And I was like, Plan B? I don't have a plan B. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have had to come up with plan B when plan A evaporates, and you often don't have a plan B just waiting in the wings to step in and do it. So I had no idea what to do. So I said, okay, I made a very quick one, which, how to fill this huge space. So I said, I'm going to make a kind of like Western sort of landscape with a lot of, fog and ponies, miniature ponies, and clouds and miniature cowboys. There would be kids with little stubble glued to their chins and cowboy hats, and they would be wandering around this space. Whoops! And there would be various lines of things from American history, just different sort of parades that went through it, and let's see what else. Yeah, various things like that. And because and this was not really an idea. It was just an idea. I had a long way to go, but they said, okay, well, we have to announce this now. And I said, really? Announce it? So they said, okay. So I got some miniature ponies, and this was the press photograph that they did right away at the Armory with all the miniature ponies. Came in, and we did these big posters that had nothing to do with anything, really. So it was just absurd. And I was very and ponies, ponies are mean. I don't know if you know that, but they're like not jolly little cute ponies. They're like, they kick and one of my sisters is a horse trainer, and she said, if ponies were people, they'd all be in jail. They're nasty. So these guys were pretty they're looking sort of cute there, but they're really not. And they didn't even like music. So anyway, I was in trouble with this, and so I by chance got in touch with a group of lawyers called Reprieve in London. And this group they're representing people who are on death row in the United States, people in prison who are on death row, and Guantanamo prisoners. So I got in touch with this group and in London, and I said, you know, I'm looking for a prisoner to work with, and maybe you can help me do this, because Homeland Security is like, can't do it in the United States. So, but you know, when you're explaining a kind of complicated project, like it's got a camera, and then you make a studio in the prison, and then you bounce it onto the, you know, and it's, you know, people don't necessarily understand that, and so I'm trying to explain that to this lawyer, and instead of saying, "Oh, thank you for telling me about your interesting project, but we can't," you know, instead she said, "Tell me more." And she was the lead lawyer of Reprieve. And after a couple of weeks of discussing what I wanted to do, she said, "I think I have somebody you might want to collaborate with you." And she got me in touch with Mohammed al-Ghurani. He was the youngest detainee in Guantanamo. And he was detained when he was 12. And he was in prison until he was 21. He was never charged, as 98% of the people in Guantanamo were never charged with anything. They were just pretty much bought. So at that time we needed Saudis because that was the profile of who supposedly were the terrorists. So we brought in all the Saudis. Mohammed was a 12-year-old boy then, and he went to computer school in Pakistan. He was a Saudi, Chadian in Saudi. And he went to his uncle's school. He happened to be in the mosque. And that's when the U.S. Army swept in and captured him with zero evidence. They charged him with being a terrorist who was working in London as a spy. And this was just a boy. He was tortured until he was 21. His teeth were ripped out. He was cut all over. He was put in solitary. Many of his bones were broken. Of course, we were not allowed to say any of those things because you're not allowed to say. For example, American psychiatrists were at every single torture session and still are in Guantanamo. But we're not allowed to say that. We have to say the American behavioral consultancy team was at each session. So it's language, it's stories, it's the way you kind of tell your story. So there's the government story was plastered onto this person's life, and he's accused of whatever, but not officially because the Geneva Convention doesn't exist, because that's the other second most important language rule that happens when people are rounded up. They are immediately declared non-persons. You're a non-person, which means you have no access to the Geneva Convention, no access to anything, nothing. You're a non-person. That's how we do it. So, anyway, I went to West Africa. I met Mohammed. He's not allowed to come. All of these prisoners are put in countries that they don't even know because they're told that these are security risks and they're going to be, it's very expensive to take care of because they'll have to be guarded for life. Okay, so he's in West Africa. I went to West Africa and I said, I'm doing this project and I'm trying to explain it to him. I say, you would sit very still and then we would project, and I showed him like little models of how that would work. And you'll be really a big statue, and and I was like, he totally understood this. He totally understood it, and he said, I would like to do it because I would like to have justice, and I would like to do this with you. So we did this, and we made a big studio, and we built a studio in Africa, and we built a huge statue the size of a Lincoln Memorial, and here's the people here, and Mohammed learned to sit very, very still, and he was beamed onto the statue. And he also, it was going to be a sort of silent thing, but he was so articulate and such an incredible articulate person that I said, okay, now you can speak every few minutes as well, which he did. And he told, he told some things about what had happened in prison and how it was for him. And for example, one of his fellow detainees in Guantanamo had told someone that he had a dream. He told the guard that he had a dream, and he had a dream that a submarine came to rescue all the prisoners. And the next night, the American army of helicopters and ships was filling the whole bay looking for the submarine that this guy had dreamed about. This is a dark dream that we are in, of just fear and suspicion and deep craziness. So anyway, what happened with Muhammad is, you know how you know you're a 21st century person, you know where all the cameras are. If you're in somewhere, you know, oh, there's one up there, there's one up there, there's one down there. And so people who came to see this saw that he was looking at a camera very high up on the ceiling, and they realized that if they stood in front of the statue, that he could see them in Africa. So people began to stand in front of the statue and wave to the camera so that he could see them. Now, this is a person who'd been called the worst things in the whole world, and suddenly all of these Americans, who also part of this exhibition was a huge thing of presenting his case, presenting the U.S. government case versus his story, so these two parallel stories. And they knew what his story was. And so they stood in front of him and waving to him in Africa, and people brought their guitars and they played for him. People came and did dances for him. People held up huge signs, or they just tried to mouth things saying, you know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And when he saw that, Muhammad was a person who didn't cry, except when he saw that somebody was trying to help him, and then he would cry. So this whole film statue went like this once in a while, because it was really... but at those moments, I just thought I had this feeling of being able to jump from one place to another, from one story to another, really clearly. And so that was that work. I'm going to tell you one more. We're so out of time here. I'm going to tell you one more thing, because it just occurred to me now of jumping from one world to another. These are some concerts that I did, have been doing for a while, and they're for dogs. And I'm reminded of these concerts because there's so many dogs here in Madrid, and it's such a pleasure to see them like jumping around. I was trying to give a speech at a commencement ceremony in Rhode Island School of Design, and I was feeling very guilty about this because I'm supposed to talk to these young artists and say, hey, don't worry about your student debt. It's no problem. And hey, you're going to get a great job in the art world just like that. You know, it's going to be easy. It's going to be good. And I'm wearing a mortarboard hat and the big thing, and it's really hot. It's really boring. It's going on forever. We're waiting for the ceremony to start. The cellist Yo-Yo Ma was also part of. He was also going to perform or talk there and we're just so bored and hot that we're just like, ah. And I say, you know, Yo-Yo, sometimes when I'm doing a concert, I look out and I imagine that the whole audience is dogs. And he said, I have that same I have that same hallucination. I said, really? And I said, well, the next person gets to do a concert, gets to do a dog concert, has to invite the other. So I got a chance. I was invited to Sydney to be the curator of a big festival. So I got to invite artists and writers and painters and musicians and all sorts of people to come to the festival. And then I said also to the promoter, and we're also going to do a concert for dogs. And he didn't say, concert for dogs? No, he just writes down concert for dogs. I was like, do you know what that is? Okay. So we did this concert, and it was short, and it it was on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. So it was a very, very beautiful opera house with the wings and, huge flights of steps. And I thought, a few hundred dogs would come. Thousands of dogs came, thousands. And we had roped up these little areas, small, medium, and large, for people, for dogs, and with vets who were coming to see if there were any dog fights. They'd be ready, and there were no fights. And the music was with a small band that I was working with, and it was avoiding those things that sometimes scare dogs, like thunder, or the very high things that sometimes make them a little bit nervous. So they were. The thing is that these were the ideal audience members, because their people had been saying for 2 weeks, we're going to a concert, it's for music for you, and you're really going to love it. And they're like so ready by the time they get there. They're like, what is it? What is this? It's not the dog run. It's not, what is this? They didn't know why they were there. Like the way a lot of people don't know why they're at a concert either. They're just there because their friends said, you gotta go to this concert. You don't know why you're there. So they're just there. And I started with this invocation for whales, because the whales are right there in the Sydney Harbour, right there next to the plaza where we were doing this. Like, so I was thinking, why do animals sing? To find each other, like whales in the ocean, or dogs, to establish their GPS location. I'm here, I'm a mile away, I'm back here, it's territorial. So anyway, we began the concert, and it was so much fun to do. And I have to say that a lot of Australian dogs just want to rock. Want to rock. They were like, ta. Yeah. And they loved especially the rhythmic stuff. And of course we did a little bit of rhythm, because for people too, if you're, it's about tempo. It's all about time. Like if you're walking your dog and your dog is like too fast or too slow, one of you is dragging the other. It's like if you're window shopping with somebody, you have to be in the same time frame, the same tempo. So anyway, okay, I'm just about done. One more second, and then at the end. So my favorite concert goers there were the ones in the front rows. Then they were the droolers, and they were just looking like. This is so sweet, And anyway, I love music because you're with people, and in this case with other species, and it was like a really interesting way to do that. I've done some since then too, but we ended that particular show because all the dogs have been so polite, really quiet, really nice, and no troublemakers. They were just all like, and I said, okay, let's make some noise. So little dogs start yapping, and middle dogs, get your dogs, and then the big ones, and for 5 minutes these dogs barked and howled just because they could, and it was just the most wonderful sound I have ever heard. It's so free, just like anyway, that was probably one of my most memorable musical experiences. We're going to do questions, a very, very short version of questions, and I'm going to invite you back to the stage, and let's do that. Do we have any time left? We do. Okay. We do. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, good.
I'm speechless. Okay, I think I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but I think you would like maybe to invite the audience to.
I would
okay.
like to do that.
So for me, yesterday we finished our gathering speaking about the importance of freedom now you just mentioned that this is one of your best memories because of the freedom, because they barked and they howled because they could do it so. And, well, with regard to the creative process, freedom and creative process should be the same. I mean, there's no creative process without freedom. But in your case, it's been so radical. The exercise of freedom has been so radical. And I wanted to ask you about how do you protect this freedom nowadays with these such big collaborations, maybe the assignments or the difficulties that you said that you can have because your idea is too radical or too wild. How do you protect this freedom, especially now that we seem to be more and more surveilled and maybe constricted?
Well, that could be a good topic too. So I think that working around something like that is a possibility. So, for example, when I had to cancel the thing with because of Homeland Security, I realized there are other places in the world that have a different view of this. So you just kind of go around. Or also, it's good to know when to give up too, and just kind of that's enough. I'm not somebody who thinks big projects are great, and sometimes, I like to be self-sufficient, and so I'm kind of afraid of huge projects that involve a lot of people and a lot of resources and materials. So I tend to be small. I'm not ambitious. I'm not an artist who wants to open the London office and have 800, assistants and crank out cultural objects. I'm just not. I don't really have that ambition. But when there's something that does require more planning, I'm willing to do it if I can. Mm-hmm. So I guess my answer is to try to be flexible and realistic somewhat.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes. Sometimes. And also you mentioned the importance that some of the projects came out of a mistake.
They all came out of mistakes, really.
Yes. I'm very interested in the failure inside the creative process, as part of the creative process. I don't know what you think about that.
I am very addicted to failure, and I'm a kind of a disciple of Brian Eno in that way, because every time I've worked with Brian Eno in the studio, something happens and something really goes wrong, and he is so happy when that happens. He's like, because it's an opportunity then to think of it from a completely different angle and not just do your same thing over and over, but to just kind of go, well, what could we do to make that work or capitalize on the fact that it doesn't, and also, it's easy to be nice when things are going well. Mm-hmm. It's easy to be a nice person, but when things don't work out, this is when I like to watch people. How are you doing when it fails? Same with myself. I mean, I try to pay attention to that and not to be defeated by failure, but to try to make something of it. Mm-hmm. So it was. I think it's an inevitable part of whatever we do. There's a lot of things that are just don't work out, and some just plain failures, and so those are great moments. Mm-hmm.
And finally, yesterday we talked about loss and loneliness and fear, and I thought, well, that's sad. Let's talk about beauty. I wanted to ask you the importance of beauty in your artworks, even if these tough artworks related with very difficult issues, like one you mentioned about Guantanamo Kid. But there's always like the resistance of beauty inside your work, as I see it. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, I am addicted to beauty as well. I just love to see something that is I mean, especially with things like painting. I mean, I don't really care that something has this meaning or fits into some kind of bigger narrative. I'm just very seduced by things that are just, kind of astoundingly beautiful. So and there's no explaining that, really, right? I mean, what do you say to explain that? It's just something that opens your heart. You're just like, it's astounding. So, fortunately, it doesn't work to put it into a context exactly, except that it's the context of who we are as people, and we're now, of course, there's all kinds of things that people consider beautiful. Ugly beautiful, silly beautiful, sentimental beautiful, and that's what makes beautiful so interesting.
I agree. So I think let's open up to other people. I think they would be delighted to ask something.
Do you like a microphone?
The microphone, yes. Thank you. We don't have much time, so I guess there's plenty of questions, but I think we'll have to keep it to 3, maybe. Failure.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah, I'm here. I'll be faster.
Yeah, someone already.
Okay.
Okay, I have it. Sorry. So, thank you very much. Alberto Levi, ITP NYU alumni. So, on collaboration, how much and how do you enforce your vision when you collaborate with other smart artists in collaboration? Do you enforce your main idea, your concept, or do you let it go and see what happens?
Well, here I am showing work that is an absolute collaboration with my collaborator Shen Wang. That it's very unusual. I don't usually collaborate with people. I'm not. That's not in my skill set. But I wanted to do virtual reality, and it's very heavy programming, and it's very, very time intensive. So you need a bit of a team. So with Shen and I, we pretty much spend all our time making each other laugh. There's something that is so much fun working with him and it's about like sort of breaking rules. So it's a real pleasure. So, for example, in a work like this, like Chalkroom, I would outline what the sort of stories and themes would be and do the drawings, and then the engine of the piece and the way it's expressed architecturally are his. So that's the way that particular collaboration works, and it works very well for us because it's fairly flexible. You know, I can go over into his area, he can go over into mine a little bit too. So I don't do that musically very much. I'm not, mostly because the music that I make is kind of hard to count, and so people who are used to a more downbeat sort of thing get frustrated, and so I tend to work with them in slightly different ways. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, Laurie. Congratulations, it was very inspiring. I am Gonzalo Carmona, I am an entrepreneur. I would like to know, how do you handle with your love and hate for your country, for the US? In the first 2 slides, there were 2 American flags, and then you were talking about Guantanamo, and you were criticizing politically, socially, American policy. So how do you handle on a personal level and also as an artist? Thank you.
On a personal level, it's very disastrous now. I mean, it really is. But of course, on the other hand, it's also intensely interesting because you have, in terms of language, because in an entire subset of language is being subverted and called fake news, and you're like, what kind of story is that? It's really, really fascinating how that works. So I don't think that artists necessarily have an obligation at all to do political work. I think that's a very we don't have an obligation to do anything really, except whatever. So I go back and forth. I tend to make things that are more political when there's a swing to the right, and when there's a swing to the left, I kind of relax and I make more things that are just kind of beautiful. But right now, I'm preparing a show that it will be have a lot of that kind of stuff in it, and it will be in Washington D.C. In the next election. So I am taking that very seriously. What I'm trying to do at that point, and to try to. Address some of those things, because not because I think it's going to change the world, but when I think of does art change the world, or does music change things, or how does what is that connection like? I think of somebody like Bob Dylan, and he wrote songs he's the first person who wrote songs for losers. I mean, people didn't write that way for, particularly like that. And he began to kind of romanticize the loser. And it was very empathetic. And it was very new. And so I thought, well, we're all losers, at one time or another, of course. And so just to acknowledge that and to feel for that part of us is so generous. And I think that creates empathy, and empathy is what is the number one thing that I think any kind of political situation it's crucial to any political situation. Empathy. If you don't have that, then it just becomes an oligarchy or something that's dictating for the fortunate few, instead of for all of us. So the generation of empathy, I think that's also, in many ways, it's a very natural part of a lot of art, because it just kind of was, look at this, and whoa, So it's about communication. So it's another step to make it about criticism of a political situation. I'm interested in taking that extra step at the moment. In general, I don't think political art is more meaningful than non-political art at all. I don't think it's better, or it's just a different thing, different way to do things.
One last question, maybe.
Hello. Yeah, I think it works. I would like to ask you can you be arrested by doing political art in the U.S.?
Arrested?
Yes.
Yes,
in prison.
you can be arrested. Yes, you can be arrested.
Do you have a lot
so
of
when you get my
artists?
letter from jail, you remember what I said? Help! No, there's such a thing as freedom of speech, but a lot of things are now being questioned that were taken for granted constitutionally. So, for example, birthright. So that's a constitutional right in the United States. If you're born there, you're a citizen. So now one of the things that the president has declared is that that's not necessarily true. So we are entering a potential constitutional crisis because, there has to be a bottom line in which people agree on something. And in that case, it's our Constitution. It's a written series of laws that are interpretable, but they're not, when suddenly somebody says the opposite of what it is, that creates a crisis. So I think it's not necessarily going to go that way, but it's possible. So, and again, like I was saying, with the way language can be tweaked, and the way someone can be called a non-person or can be called not a U.S. citizen just by decree, is something that I think writers and artists are very, very interested in, because it's about the nuance of what is, who's telling that story and how are they telling that story. So it's a very I think interesting thing to maybe build on. I do not have big ambitions to change the world. I really like the world as it is, even with all the messed up problems. You know, I'm not, you know, somebody who's charging in going, this has to change. You know, things change. Things will change anyway. It's just like, you know, people who are saying we're going into the 6th extinction, you know, and as if we're not already in it. You know, we're already in it. And so I think you can kind of live in a dream world in certain ways, but I think for stories are one of the things that I've been doing with some other artists is initiated by some libraries, the Black Diamond Library in Copenhagen. They're inviting artists and climate people to talk together about the future. I did one recently with an artist named Sean from Iceland, who is a really interesting writer and has spent a lot of time looking at climate. And he's saying, you know, we can't talk about this in public. It's too dark. You know, it's too dark what's happening. And we had a lot of conversations about that because, you know, we kind of agreed that, you know, these stories about the tech fire engines rolling in at the last minute and saying right at the tipping point and fixing the climate. And if you think that's going to happen, you're out of your mind. You know, it's not happening. It's not happening. So what is it then to talk about the future or to tell a story about the future? A story is when somebody is listening. And if you believe that you're in the 6th extinction, then you're telling a story to no one. And that is an awesome thing. That we would be the last human beings to tell a story to no one. That is a huge responsibility. It's also a huge responsibility to prevent that from happening. You know, and I'm an activist and believe in trying to prevent that from happening. You know, but it is a distinct possibility. And so, being in part of these discussions with people, it really is shocking for me because it means looking at those very dire situations and trying to be clear about it and trying not to be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, because it is really a quite amazing era that we are living in, you know, and looking at, and quite an amazing future that we need to be able to define, and not to shirk our responsibility from defining it, even though it may not look so merry, you know. But anyway, I didn't really want to end on such a dark I'm looking for something happy to say. I'm a happy person because I'm just an idiot, you know, and I think, and I want to thank all of you for being here, because I know that you're also making things, and from the number of hands that I see, and that's the greatest
antidote.
Yeah, it's the greatest. It is the only answer. It's the only answer to make something very beautiful, make something incredibly beautiful. So I want to encourage all of you to just ignore what I just said and make the most beautiful thing that you can possibly imagine. And anyway, that's it. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laurie. Gracias a todos.